All right, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us for workshop number 2, Culturally Responsive Literacy Practices. I'm Dana Stachowiak. I'm here with the Educator Collaborative. I think I'm maybe showing up. There I am. Hi. I'm here with the Educator Collaborative, and I have the honor of presenting with my lovely wife Sylvia and our wonderful colleague Jeanette. They're both out of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. When they speak today, I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves to you all so you can get to know them a little bit better. For me, I'll go ahead and introduce myself right now. Besides working with the Educator Collaborative, I'm also an assistant professor of diversity/multicultural education at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. I spend my days teaching in the swamps and hanging out with my 2 dogs, Amos and Henry, and kayaking on the bayou. So I want to go ahead and share with you our, quickly, I'm new at this, so please forgive me. I'm going to go ahead and share with you, can you all see that? I hope so. I want to go ahead and share with you just kind of logistics of today. So in keeping with the Educator Collaborative, we want to go ahead and make sure that you can collaborate along with us as we are sharing our session with you today. So if you take a look at the screen right now, I want to welcome you to live tweet along with our session. You can use my Twitter handle as you do that, at Dr. Stachowiak, and also please, please, please use the hashtag the EdCollabGathering space, make sure you have that space, hashtag number 2. That way we can get all the tweets that you're sending to us, and if we need to respond to you, we can go ahead and do that. We're going to try to respond to questions if we can as we go throughout our session, and if not, we'll try to get to those at the end. So please tweet. If something's really awesome and you really love it, go ahead and tweet that as well, and just share with us the things that you're learning and questions that you have. The other thing I want to share with you all is down here on the bottom. Go ahead and email us if you'd like to hear more from us or talk to us about
Oh no. So it looks like Dana just got kicked off. Yes.
I'm sorry. We just had a really big boom of thunder and here I am. So let me go ahead. Sorry about that. We're in the middle of a little bit of a storm here. Let me go ahead and screen share with you. I think I was talking about, can you all see that? Hopefully. Go ahead and email us. I think that's where I left off. Go ahead and email us if you'd like to contact us about more information of what we share today. So our emails are right there, and this is going to be archived, so if you need to find us, you can go back in the archives and look for us. So moving right along, I want to go ahead and share with you our goals for today. So today, one of the very first things that we want to do that Sylvia is going to be highlighting is we want to provide you with an overview of culturally responsive teaching. What does that look like? What does that mean that you embody as an educator to be culturally responsive? The next thing that we're going to talk about today is defining and discussing why we need culturally responsive literacy instruction. So we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, what is it and why is it important? And then Jeanette is going to go ahead and go through and guide you through choosing culturally responsive text. She put together with another colleague and a little bit of myself a really great checklist that is sure to be incredibly helpful for you in choosing culturally responsive text. So I'm going to go ahead and give this over to Sylvia as she talks about an overview of culturally responsive teaching.
Okay, so hi everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. I am an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I teach in a cultural foundations program that has an emphasis on social justice. And one of the classes that I really like to teach is culturally responsive leadership, and I teach a critical multicultural ed class in which I also talk about culturally responsive teaching. So this is something that I'm passionate about and happy to be sharing with you all. So as Dana mentioned, I'm going to be providing the overview of culturally responsive teaching. There are lots of scholars that have been writing about this. However, there are a few that are kind of most well-known, prominent in the field. Both Gloria Ladson-Billings and Lisa Delpit have several books and articles written about culturally responsive teaching and related topics of multicultural education and culturally relevant pedagogy. And Geneva Gay actually wrote a book that's titled Culturally Responsive Teaching. And for this talk, I'm going to be drawing primarily upon their work. So I wanted to start by saying that although there may be some debate as to whether or not culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy are distinct, what I found in looking at the literature is that the core ideas overlap, and those are the ideas that I'll be discussing today. So you will hear me go back and forth in using the terms culturally responsive and culturally relevant. So I want to start with a simple definition of culturally relevant teaching by Gloria Ladson-Billings. She defines culturally relevant teaching as the ability of teachers to see and value the cultures of the students that they teach. So what culturally responsive teachers do is integrate the culture and experiences of the students who are not part of the mainstream and teach more effectively to those students, and then also simultaneously increase the cultural competency of all the students in the classroom. And when I say students who are not part of the mainstream, most often in the literature that's referring to students of color, and most often African American and Latino students. But I like to think of, and many scholars think of, cultural responsiveness more broadly in thinking about any students who might be marginalized. So that could be in terms of class, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of physical and mental abilities, etc. So to start off, I want to emphasize that culture is the key word here in culturally responsive teaching. And to begin with, we have to start asking, what is culture? And I draw this information from a video by Gloria Ladson-Billings, where she explains that there are these two different aspects of culture. There are the aspects that are visible or tangible, like food, dress, crafts, etc. And sometimes when people are learning about this, that's where it seems to stop. But the aspects that I think are perhaps even more important to pay attention to are the ones that are invisible. And these are things like values, beliefs, feelings, perspectives, assumptions, essentially the lenses through which we make meaning of the world. So the reason why we even have discussions about culturally relevant pedagogy is because there's been an incompatibility between the school culture and the culture of some of the students, and this often results in students doing poorly in school. Until people started engaging in discussions of culturally responsive teaching, often the solution was to demand that the students conform to the school culture, and most of the time this doesn't work. Either the students don't know how to do this, or the students actively resist it because asking them to conform without compromising isn't showing respect and dignity. So what culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching asks us to do is to recognize that there is this incompatibility between mainstream culture and students of color and other marginalized students' ways of learning. So what happens is when we're trying to teach from a particular cultural lens, and there is kind of a dominant cultural lens that we learn to teach from, all of us, regardless of who we are in our own positionalities, and then students are trying to receive that information, and if their lenses are very different from our lenses, then often the learning just doesn't occur, and then that results in students not doing well in school. So what culturally responsive teaching does is it demands that we see and value the cultures of the students that we teach, and then adjust our teaching practices accordingly. Now, Chris Gutierrez cautions that in our efforts to do this, we need to be careful not to conflate race and ethnicity with culture. If we do that, then we can fall into the trap again of creating a new one-size-fits-all approach. And we also need to be cautious to not expect our students to be representatives of the cultures or groups that they belong to. Thus, to be culturally responsive teachers, we need to do a few things. First, We need to view ourselves as learners and strive to know our students well. Second, we need to be reflexive about who we are and our own cultural lenses. And this means that we actually have to take the time to stop and think about what we believe in and where those ideas come from. And the more that we are aware of our own beliefs and values, the invisible parts of our own culture, then the more we can see how those match or don't match the students that we're working with, and conscientiously make efforts to have those lenses come together in a way that facilitates the learning of all students. Third, we need to create a sense of community and caring in our classrooms. And this is important so that students will want to share who they are and tell us about what matters to them. Because if we don't create that space, then it will be difficult for us to learn about who they are and their cultures, which then makes it difficult for us to actually even engage in culturally responsive teaching. We need to honor and respect students' home culture, and that includes honoring and respecting home languages that might differ from standard formal English that we prioritize in schools. And then we need to involve parents whenever possible. And I know that sometimes this feels difficult, and parents often don't have the time to do this, but we can do this through inviting people as guest speakers, having students interview their parents, and then bringing that back into the classroom, asking people to be volunteers. So including the family so that we can find out more about the home culture is really important. In addition, we also need to just acknowledge and value the brilliance in all students. This means that we need to take an asset-based approach instead of focusing on what students lack. Louise Moll talks about this as recognizing that all students come with funds of knowledge. So what happens is that students who come with funds of knowledge that match what we are trying to teach and what we see as our own funds of knowledge are the ones that often get recognized for those funds. But everybody has knowledge. Everybody brings with them skills and things that they know that others may not know. And the more that we can recognize that and create the space for all students to share their funds of knowledge, then the more culturally responsive we will be. We also simultaneously need to ensure that students learn the basic skills that they need in order to be successful in U.S. American society and schools. So this comes down to teaching more, not less. Several scholars who write about culturally responsive teaching talk about how in their research in schools with teachers, sometimes what they see is that students who are struggling basically get left off the hook or are given the permission to fail. And instead, what culturally responsive teaching requires us to do is to increase the teaching so that students gain that information so that they can be a part of the learning community. While we're doing this, we need to really demand critical thinking, and demand is a key word here. So instead of just asking for, hoping for critical thinking, if we demand it from all students, and they learn a valuable skill that they can use anywhere. And throughout all this, we need to maintain high expectations, which goes back to seeing the brilliance in all students. So this is a really quick overview of what being a culturally responsive teacher entails, and I will pass it back to Dana so that she can talk to you about some of the strategies.
All right. So thanks, Sylvia. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what we mean when we say culturally responsive literacy. So when something that really helps, that's really helpful for me when thinking about culturally responsive literacy is to think about what it is and what it is not. So when doing that, I reflect on the ways that our teaching practices in literacy have changed over the decade. And I put those into three categories that I like to call old school, multicultural, and culturally responsive. So if we take a look at old school first, think of it as your grandma's way of teaching literacy, and this might even be how you were taught in school. So very first thing to think about is that it is teacher-centered. The teacher reads aloud something that he or she chose as the students follow along all together. The students might do round robin reading or popcorn reading, but this is done in a whole group setting. Everyone's in their rows, the teacher's reading, the students are following along and maybe reading a little bit, but all in the same text. Students probably read some on their own, and then they answer a set of questions, but it's all the same and it's all chosen by the teacher. Also, in the old school way, we rely heavily on scripted text. Chances are the teacher didn't choose those questions that the students are answering or the books, rather they were scripted in some kind of basal reader. Now, we also, in the old school way, might have also seen students in groups where they were like the chickens and the hens and the cows or whatever. But those books were generally flat and, again, chosen by the teacher, but as scripted by the teacher's manual. So students aren't given the opportunity to read for pleasure. That they just read and answer the questions. The other thing that we often see in the old school is just reading popular text. So when I was in 8th grade, for example, everyone, and I mean everyone, was reading Fahrenheit 451, and not for any other reason but that it was really popular at that time. And it certainly was not accessible for all readers, because I know that I never knew what the hell was going on until I reread it a couple of years later. I just had no clue. I hated reading that book. The first time, I didn't want to read it the second time, but I really wanted to try and understand. But again, it was just a popular text that we were reading, and I wasn't engaged at all, and I was confused most of the time. It wasn't accessible to me. So we often saw that in the old school way. The other way, doing what's comfortable, or what I like to call the but I've always done it this way syndrome. And this is the one I hear the most, especially from folks who don't think that they're stuck teaching in the old school way. I hear them say, but Charlotte's Web is always studied in 5th grade, which that's okay, but if you look around your urban classroom, do you really see any students who can relate to Charlotte, this white girl being raised on a farm, talking to pigs and spiders and things? Anyway, or not Charlotte, anyway. But while there are some strong storylines in the book, readers are not going to be engaged in and learn as much from the book if they can't relate to the characters. Just because it's what you've always done or what's always been done somewhere else doesn't mean it's good. My advice is just to evolve, people, evolve. Get away from the old school version. In the old school version, we thought we were maybe being multicultural or culturally responsive, but the text that we use often only focused on stereotypical holidays, heroes, and customs. I can't tell you how many teachers I have observed, and just recently actually, only teaching about Cinco de Mayo as the premier Mexican holiday, when it's actually become about people, generally not Mexicans, going out and drinking margaritas and eating hard-shell tacos to celebrate what they think is the Mexican Day of Independence. Little note, it's not about that, but that's clear that the teaching about Cinco de Mayo as it's been done in the old school way wasn't even effective, because 9 times out of 10, if you ask anybody what Cinco de Mayo is about, they have no clue. And a note, hard-shell tacos don't even exist in Mexico. It's something made up by people in the United States as a American version of the taco. So you might be saying at this point, but Dana, we've heard all of these things about being bad. We don't do them. We choose to do things that are similar to Reader's Workshop or some form of Reader's Workshop, where we let the children choose their books, and we spend a lot of time celebrating multiculturalism and diversity. And while this is all really great, and there's been this popular shift for us to start thinking towards multicultural literacy for years. The shift is good, and it's been bad. It's good because it's encouraged a few really great practices, and I'll highlight those really quickly. And I'll highlight the things that maybe aren't so great. So what multicultural literacy has done is it has encouraged student-centered learning, where the teachers have students to participate in the read aloud, they allow children to choose their own books, and they engage in meaningful conversations, usually in conferences, small group or individual. These are all really good things. But how often are those meaningful conversations that you're having during read-alouds and during conferences, how often are they happening about the content of the book? That is the multiculturalism that's celebrated in the book, along with the conversations about the good reading strategies. And my guess is very few are related to the content and the issues in the book and more about the strategies. So while student-centered is a really good move, we need to be culturally responsive, which I'll talk about in a second. We need to really start thinking about what do those conversations look like outside of just reading strategies. The next thing that multicultural literacy has made available is multiple texts. And again, this is a great shift. It's so important that our students have access to more than one text about Cinco de Mayo. They need to have texts about Chavez, about a young American girl missing her father who is in Mexico because he got deported. Because Mexican-American students in your classroom are about more than a holiday made popular only in the United States. So while multiple texts being made available is a really good thing, we also need to think about what those texts are that we have in our classroom and make sure that they don't further harmful stereotypes of our minority students. In multicultural literacy, we not only have those multiple texts available, but we also use them, but they're not necessarily responsive texts. So here's where we really start to see this idea of multicultural literacy fall short a bit. Instead of choosing books for our classroom that are truly responsive to and valuing of our students' cultures, we've often fallen into the trap of just having all kinds of so-called multicultural texts in our classroom. Because the more exposure they have to those texts, the better, right? So yes and no, because oftentimes we focus on multicultural literacy. When we focus on multicultural literacy, we focus on the quantity of the text rather than the quality. So my advice to you is that if you have enough money to either buy 2 really culturally responsive texts or 10 multicultural responsive texts, or 10 multicultural texts, just buy the 2. That's fine. Choose quality over quantity. Just because a book has an African American child on the cover and in the storyline does not necessarily mean that the book is best for the classroom. It may not represent that child in the most positive light. It may reinforce stereotypes and things that are harmful. Meaning the storyline, depending, could actually end up reinforcing that stuff for our African American children, not just for the ones that maybe see some parts of themselves reflected in that text, but also for our other students who are learning about different students and different cultures. Jeanette's going to talk a little bit more about using and choosing those books in her session, in her part of the session. The next thing that multicultural education has done is helped us to think about celebrating diversity. And this is where everybody gets really excited, and it kind of goes along with the one above. Everybody wants to celebrate diversity and have a multicultural fair and do all these kinds of things, but this can go awry. The shift towards multicultural literacy, while it's in the right direction, has led a lot of us to focus on just celebrating that diversity. And you might be thinking, but isn't this what we're supposed to do? Isn't this a good thing? And it is somewhat. But usually when teachers focus on multicultural lit and celebrating diversity, it's conflated, like Sylvia warned, to mean the same thing as culture. And for that to mean the same thing as race then, and that's problematic. Most often diversity is conflated just to mean racial diversity. So we often will stock our classroom libraries with books of people of different races, but we don't start to think about including things with characters that are non-Christian or gay or female. We tend to just fall in the area of thinking of racial diversity. And like stated earlier in the presentation, we often stop at the things that are visible and tangible, raising just an awareness of surface level aspects like food or clothing, instead of working towards understanding those things that are invisible within cultures like values and beliefs. Again, awareness is good, but it's not great. And it doesn't necessarily help to reflect our students accurately. So now you might be asking, okay, Dana, so just what is culturally responsive literacy? I can see Jeanette on the other side of this. You all can't see her, but I can see her laughing at me. You're throwing me off. Anyway, so culturally responsive literacy, very first is awesome, so I'm just going to just put that out there. And I want to bring back the Gloria Ladson-Billings quote that Sylvia highlighted. It's important here. So she said that culturally responsive teaching is the ability of teachers to see and value the cultures of the students that they teach. So culturally responsive literacy must be reflective of this. Within culturally responsive literacy, let me pull up my slides again. Here we go. Within culturally responsive literacy, we have a student to teacher partnership. And this is more than a student-centered classroom. It's where the teacher and the students work together to understand the different cultures within the classroom and within the larger community. Both the student and the teacher take an active part in teaching and learning. Students' lived experiences in their lives are highlighted and used as ways to teach others about their culture, not just reading books. We also might bring in, like Sylvia suggested, members of the community, parents, whomever, to tell stories, to share their experiences. So it's not just about the teacher or student finding information or reading a story in a book and sharing it. It's really about using students and teachers and the community members' lived experiences to help us learn about different cultures. The other thing that culturally responsive literacy does, and it kind of goes along with the others, is with multicultural literacy, is that it uses and makes multiple texts available. And this is similar to, again, that multicultural literacy. We might use them in multicultural literacy, but they're not necessarily responsive texts. So the texts that you need to choose for culturally responsive literacy need to be appropriate and need to be validating of our students' lives. And Jeanette's going to go into more detail on that in just a few, so I won't go into more detail. The next thing, using inclusive text. This means texts that are reflective of the class and community. I've said this over and over. I can't say it enough. It needs to be reflective of the class and the community, not just what is popular. Sylvia talked about, and what Jeanette is going to elaborate on later, it needs to be not just those texts that have been deemed by the experts to be multicultural. The texts that you choose need to represent more than the top 5 or whatever cultures or races or whatever. The books need to represent not just different cultures, but they also need to have really rich storylines that reflect the students in your classroom, their experiences. They need to be relatable, and that they need to be multifaceted in dealing with real life situations, not some arbitrary situation that some person who's not even of that culture decided to make up because they thought it was a great idea. Anyway, so not only is culturally responsive literacy about inclusivity, but it's also about using texts that deal with real social issues across cultural differences. This means that the text that you choose shouldn't just share information about different cultures within a storyline, but should also share issues of privilege and power. These should be pretty explicit and thoughtful in the storylines. Issues of heteronormativity, sexism, and racism, for example, should all be present. And yes, you can find really great books that have these topics at the K-2 level. I know a lot of people get worried when we think about culturally responsive literacy. We think, oh, well, our students at the K-2 level, they really can't grasp that. But actually, yeah, they can. They deal with it every day, just not using the terminology that we use. And it is totally acceptable and appropriate to teach these using, again, culturally responsive texts that are really good, not just texts that have been deemed multicultural or good. And the last thing I want to talk about that culturally responsive teaching literacy does that's different from multicultural literacy. When we think about multicultural literacy, again, it celebrates diversity, which is fine, but all that does is raise an awareness of the different pieces of diversity. When we talk about culturally responsive literacy supporting equity, this just means that you need to meet the needs of your students, not try to support an equal number of books, for example, on Muslims and Buddhists, if most of your students in your classroom are Muslim. Now, you should have a selection of texts on both topics, but if you have more of a need for texts with Muslim characters, strong storylines with Muslim characters, then have more of those in your classroom library, not necessarily having an equal number. That's not really doing justice. Again, it needs to reflect your students. And I want to talk really quickly before I move on. I want to make a quick note about choosing your classroom libraries and stocking them with culturally responsive texts. Now, first, it's only fair that I let you know that these texts are going to be hard to find, as there are very few well-written books out there. But they're there, so don't stop looking. And I'm happy, and I know Jeanette and Sylvia would probably be happy to share with you some lists that we have if you want to email us, if you want to go back and get our email address, or tweet me and say, hey, can you send me that list, or whatnot. Find us somehow if you want a list of really great culturally responsive texts. We can offer that to you, or you can just find pretty decent ones online, but make sure you don't type in multicultural text, you type in culturally responsive text. So keep looking, don't stop looking, but I will tell you they're going to be a little more difficult to find. But again, Jeanette's going to talk to you about how to choose those books and look for those, so it should become a little bit easier for you to scope those out. I'm also wanting to think about this realistically. You might not have enough in your budget to add more text, right? You've stocked up on those ho-hum, really popular multicultural texts. Your school purchased them, when they were on the let's celebrate multiculturalism bandwagon, so you don't necessarily have money and you can't move forward to purchase maybe some better books. So what do you do now? And actually, you can still use the books that you have in your library, even if they aren't so great. You can use these books with caution, and you do that by embodying what Sylvia shared about the aspects of being a culturally responsive teacher, embodying that, and then you're going to learn from Jeanette how to choose those texts. So you'll be able to pick out some teachable pieces in those ho-hum texts you might have. So you might have a text that doesn't fall along the lines as necessarily being culturally responsive all the way through, but there might be a really great piece in there that shares something really important. You can just pull out that selection of that text and encourage your students to think about that critically and think about the way that characters are portrayed or cultures are portrayed. So you're not stuck. You can still use those for teachable moments. So as I get ready to hand this over to Jeanette, I want to just end here really quickly with talking about, so why do we need culturally responsive literacy instruction? Hopefully that has become clear, but if not, let me point those things out for y'all. First, we want to make sure that we are debunking any harmful stereotypes, myths, and misconceptions. So many of the popular so-called multicultural texts out there actually reinforce harmful stereotypes, myths, and misconceptions about our minority students. As culturally responsive educators, we need to work to validate the reality for our students, not the hegemonic thinking like so many books do now. The next thing, we need to allow students to see themselves and their cultural identity in mainstream curriculum, not just as a special unit because it's Mexican American month or Hispanic month or African American month or whatever. We need to have our students be able to see themselves in mainstream curriculum. I just want you to stop and think about how much more you are engaged in a book or a movie or in something when you see someone in the storyline that's similar to you and not portrayed in a negative way, but portrayed in a really good positive way. Our kids need this too. And finally, we need culturally responsive literacy instruction to increase student engagement in literacy, achievement in English language arts and math, science, social studies, all the subjects, and to increase their engagement in being socially responsive. So I think that sums it up. And Jeanette, I'm gonna let you take the screen and talk to us about how to choose culturally responsive text.
Okay, great. I hope everyone can see and hear me. I'm very excited to be here, not laughing at Dana, but just very excited to be with two colleagues who share my passion for the topic. So I also work at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm an assistant professor and I teach social studies methods for people seeking licensure in elementary education. So literature is a very important aspect of that teaching, and social studies, as many of you probably know, has become increasingly marginalized in our elementary classrooms, and so we think of doing content integration between language arts and social studies, but unfortunately this usually manifests as a very surface level read aloud and little as in terms of critical or in-depth thinking or culturally responsive pedagogy. So I have an agenda for trying to teach my students about more meaningful integration of these two subject areas, and in doing so I work really hard with them and diligently with them to pick culturally responsive literature so that they're not, as Dana alluded to or explicitly stated, choosing just rehashing popular literary texts that may or may not be keeping up with our current views on inclusiveness in our classrooms. So what I've come up with is a brief checklist that we can use when teaching or selecting books for culturally responsive literature in our classrooms. Like I said, I teach social studies methods primarily, so I have a mixture of selections of both literature and one nonfiction text as well. And I do want to say I agree wholeheartedly with what Dana said. If you have stocked yourself with culturally multicultural texts, please do still use this checklist with them and make use of them, because you can really get into some deep thinking dialogue and deliberation with even the youngest of children by troubling some of the content presented in those texts as well. So without further ado, let's talk through our checklist a little bit. Okay, I just got a little bit of a time alert, so I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker. Okay, so the first thing we want to think about is what kind of information is represented in this text. We want to think about historical and/or informational accuracy, and not just about what's presented, but the tone and the language used within the text. So does it seem to present biased images? For example, if the text is about indigenous people, are they shown to speak rudimentary broken English, or is there actually a representation of the complex language systems that most indigenous people used? Okay, next, from language, very important. So we want to make sure that we're seeing positive and affirming language. Here we're not only looking for an absence of derogatory language, but we're also looking for language that describes different types of people in very positive and affirming terms. We also want to pay attention to illustrations because we're working with young learners. Often we think, oh, we can't broach social justice topics with kindergartners. Yes, we can, but we want to be mindful of illustrations. So these are very subtle messages. One of the top things I do when I look through a book is I say to myself, what is the story being conveyed if I don't read any of the words and only look at the pictures? Am I making sure that differences are valued and honored? And then above all, we want to make sure that we're showing an equitable and responsible representation of characters within the story. So we want to make sure that we see the characters in a variety of settings doing a variety of things. Not every African American father is in jail, right? So we want to see African American males that have professional jobs, that make everyday decisions, and that lead their families, for example, right? Okay, so now I want to bring our attention to a couple of particular texts that I use with my classes. The first one, thinking about historical and informational accuracy, I like to use a book called In My Family, or In Mi Familia. And this book represents Mexican American culture in a positive light and also in an informational light. So it's told kind of in a variety of vignettes that situate the author as she was growing up, memory stories about her culture, and as Dana said, it's not leveled down to we celebrate Cinco de Mayo and drink margaritas. It really gives an in-depth explanation of some of the popular cultural aspects of Mexican Americans with a rationale for why those things exist. So it's in it, and one of the big things for me is that it's written both in English and in Spanish. The characters are also engaged in meaningful activities, so I like that one. And as you see on the slide, we have some guiding questions for you to think about as you look at other books that might depict informational text. Moving on to our second category, thinking about illustrations, I chose a book called And Tango Makes Three. I know there is a little bit of critique of the book because the characters representing the same-sex couples are penguins, but I would like to take note of the illustrations. One of the things is that it is a neutral setting, a realistic setting for zoo animals in a city, and a note to the characters represented as animals. The nice thing about that is that it dispels gendered stereotypes and prevents the book characters from becoming caricatures of human beings. So while I recognize that critique, I also find this book to be especially helpful for using with our very youngest learners, kindergarten, first and second grade, primary grade levels. Okay. A Chair for My Mother is one of my very favorite books to use for a couple of reasons. One, this is a female-led family, and while the book does start out with a family tragedy, a fire has happened, all of the women in this family come together to solve a realistic problem, and that is refurnishing their home. But they also talk about these, the replacement of items in terms of comfort needs, not just in terms of material needs. So in social studies, I also use this book to rethink materialism in economics. So this book I find to be multifaceted, and it also helps us think about dispelling stereotypes of women as being damsels in distress who need men or other authority figures to come to their aid. The family is working class as well. I wanted to note that. So it shows them problem solving on their own through their own ingenuity, and I think that's really important. So to really think in terms of all three of these books overall, I asked the guiding questions: do these books portray women, the elderly, and or the family in valuing ways? Do these books dispel stereotypical representations of marginalized groups? And do they portray strong characters? And I would say that overall these three books do those things, and they're especially helpful because they can be used in a variety of ways, particularly integrating social studies and English language arts. So now I believe we head back over to Dana to give us some non-examples of popular texts that we sometimes get tricked into using. That was a little dramatic, but that's how it feels sometimes.
Thanks, Jeanette. So we just have a few more minutes left, so I kind of want to wrap this up. So I'm going to go through it a little bit more quickly than I had originally planned, so bear with me. I'm going to go ahead and put this up on the screen real quick. One of the books that often comes up when we want to think about representing different families, different types of parenting styles and whatnot, is Patricia Polacco's In Our Mother's House, mostly because it's Patricia Polacco and everybody loves her, which I do as well, but I have some issues with this book. It's a popular choice, but it's definitely a non-example of a culturally responsive text. And I say that because when reading through this book, number one, the storyline isn't necessarily the strongest. There's kind of really no climax. You're not really learning anything unique. But what does happen, especially in the pictures and in some of the terminology used, is that we get this very stereotypical view of two butch lesbians who are kind of hippie-ish, raising their multiracial kids that they've adopted, which is problematic because while we see that in mainstream, that's not necessarily reflective of all same-sex parents. A better but less popular example, but I'm hoping to increase the popularity today with you all, is Mommy, Mama, and Me by Newman. And this just is a really great representation opposite of In Our Mother's House. It just really shows a little bit more of reality. So I just wanted to share that with you really quick. And what I want to do now that we're coming to our close is, instead of wrapping up with a very lovely piece from Sylvia, she's going to do that really quickly, but I want to give you an example. If you get a chance, I want you to check out the book Nappy Hair and also the book I Love My Hair, and I want you to try it. I want you to look at Jeanette's guiding questions and think about being a culturally responsive educator, and which one of these books might be an example and a non-example. And go ahead and tweet us your thoughts about the two texts. Which one's more culturally responsive, why, and what are some ways you could use this text in your classroom? So just remember to think about the things that Jeanette talked about and the ways that Sylvia encouraged us to embody being a culturally responsive educator. And down here on the bottom, again, send it straight to me at my Twitter handle at Dr. Stachowiak, and also put in the Educator Collaborative #2 if you could. And then I'm going to send it over to Sylvia to just very quickly bring us to a close.
Okay, so we focused on literacy strategies for today because that was the topic of our webinar. However, these strategies only work best and may only work at all when we also think about all the other principles of culturally responsive teaching that I talked about earlier. So we'd like to thank you all for being with us, and hope that you are able to implement these strategies in your classrooms.
Thank you so much. Definitely people in the audience would love that list if you could tweet out that list of culturally responsive texts. And I just wanted to let the audience know that we do have some other sessions going on next. But great job, Dana, Jeanette, and Sylvia.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.